Ladies and gentlemen, hello. My name is Muhammad Hajali. I'm the Deputy Director for Research at Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. And in this panel, we will be looking at the past 2 weeks in which Israel has launched a military campaign against Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is a major upgrade from the type of violence that we've seen in the past year since Hezbollah decided to join the conflict on October 8th in support of the Gaza Strip. The past 2 weeks have seen great events, proportionally and historically unprecedented in the past decades, with an assassination of the Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, and attacks on Beirut, West Beirut, Central Beirut, and also the southern suburbs of Beirut, and the destruction of towns and cities across Lebanon, from the south to the Bekaa Valley, the north, and the mountains of Lebanon. With me on this panel, we have Michael Young, the managing editor of the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, and Maha Yahya, the director of the Carnegie Middle East Center, and Sanam Vakil, the director of the Middle East program and of the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House in London. I will start with a question that I think many are asking these days. Now there's, of course, a discussion about the impact of the recent Israeli escalation in Lebanon on Hezbollah, specifically looking at the claims of the organization of reorganizing its military structure and readiness for a long war. I will ask you, Michael, to begin with on this question, and see how you view this reconstruction of the organization and its ability, specifically in light of the past 2 days and the attacks on Israel, which were successfully launched by the organization.
At this point, but there was sort of an interpretation that came out in the last 2 weeks that Hezbollah was on its last legs, and because its secretary general had been killed, his anticipated successor was also killed, and senior military officials in the party and even second-tier military officials had been killed. So there was this sort of message that came out, particularly from the United States, certain corners of the United States, saying it's time for the Lebanese to free themselves. Now, my view is it's really much more complicated than that. Hezbollah as an organization, of course, has been very disoriented by this decapitation of its senior leadership, but it's much more than just an organization. It's basically anchored in an entire community, the Shia community, which is one of Lebanon's largest. At the same time, it has the backing of a major regional superpower. And so the notion that somehow Hezbollah is finished, I found, frankly, very unconvincing, and I still do. And as we saw in recent days in the south, the party has continued to be on focus in terms of targeting Israel. Now, where this will lead, I don't know, but the fact is that until now, the Israelis have not been able to return the inhabitants to the north, which was the promise, of course, of the Netanyahu government. However, one thing we should keep in mind is that I believe that a major problem Hezbollah is going to face in the future, and it's not immediately, it's not on the table now, but it will be immediately on the table once the war ends, is basically how do you revive the Shia community? The fact is that there are hundreds of thousands, if not more, Shia who are internally displaced inside Lebanon, whose villages and neighborhoods and towns have been destroyed by the Israelis. These people have to be taken home. They have to be They have to be cared for. They have to be, if I can say, there has to be some kind of framework to take these people back to their areas of residence, to rebuild their villages and towns and neighborhoods. This is going to be a very major project for Hezbollah. And there are no signs of where the funding would come from. So this is going to be a major challenge for Hezbollah. And if by chance outside parties are willing to rebuild these towns and villages and neighborhoods, meaning Western countries or even Arab countries, there will be conditions imposed on Hezbollah through this reconstruction process. This is where I think the party is going to have much more difficulty, in a way, re-establishing a status quo ante for itself. In other words, it will not be able to go back to where it was before the Israeli attacks 2-3 weeks ago, before a long time. It's going to take time, and it's also going to encourage other Lebanese parties to be more inflexible with Hezbollah's demands, because because they've seen that Hezbollah is vulnerable. And if I could just end on this note, that's the good version. The bad version is that Hezbollah will, in a way, seeing itself isolated in the country, may, in a way, try to react against Lebanese society. It has the weapons, it has the men, it has the solidarity. It may, in order to revive itself, try to create a certain sectarian solidarity by opening internal fronts against other Lebanese groups. This is very dangerous, it's very risky, and I don't think there's any leader today in Hezbollah who is able to control really this, the way that, for example, Hassan Nasrallah was able to control this after the 2006 war. I'm not saying that will happen, I'm saying it's something that we should be very aware of.
Thank you, Michael. On this note, specifically speaking about the Lebanese political context, because this is quite significant in defining the what's next for Hezbollah, specifically if the war ends, and if it ends soon, and it doesn't look like it. It looks like a long war, as you've mentioned in earlier comments. Maha, I'm going to ask you about the significance of this. How important is the political context in that regard, and how do you see it developing? I mean, now we're seeing calls for 1701, 1559 resolutions, and there's a debate around these two resolutions and how they will basically impact the future and how the future solution is designed. So please, the floor is yours now.
Thank you, Mohannad. Thank you, colleagues, for joining, and whoever is online. Look, I concur with what Michael presented, and I think Hezbollah is in a bind moving forward. It was already in a bind. We kept talking about it being caught between a rock and a hard place. When it entered into the fray of battle on October 8, 2023, I think the calculus was this would be another Gaza round, a month or two, and then it would be over and we go back to October 6, the status quo ante. 1 year of horrific bloodshed in Gaza, but also in Lebanon, has shown that calculus was totally off. And over the past 3 weeks, the intensification of the horrific uptick in fighting, but also the targeted attacks against Hezbollah, including the pager terror attack that hit ordinary people, has really put it in a very difficult position. On the one hand, there is tremendous losses, including the loss of Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, a loss on in the military leadership, but even in some of the civil servants. Let's remember that Hezbollah is 3 components. There's the political arm, there is the civil arm, civil society, society organizations that deal with health, education, all sorts of social services, and then there's the military arm. And they've suffered losses in every single one of those sectors. What we're witnessing today, and I think this is where the It's a bit too early to tell, but the indications that we have so far is that Iran has stepped into the fray to say decision-making is now with me. The main local interlocutor has been killed, and therefore they stepped into the fray to try and rally the troops, gather, uplift morale, and try and manage this transition while Hezbollah tries to reconstitute itself, particularly on the political front, and the concerns that, as Michael said, and as you said, Muhannad, other political parties are looking at this as an opportunity to either, jump on some sort of a bandwagon and say, we're here, or to undermine Hezbollah further internally. Hezbollah already had very contentious relationships with almost all communities in Lebanon, other communities in Lebanon, and this has begun since the year 2000, when Israel unilaterally withdrew from Lebanon and Hezbollah refused to disarm. So the debate today, I think Lebanon is at a very dangerous seeing this already. They are active on the ground in terms of trying to help support the displaced, but the needs are so huge that they cannot cope on their own. And if it wasn't for Lebanese solidarity, I think people would be in a much more dire situation than they already are. We've seen churches across the country, people in different communities. Some are shutting them out, others are opening their doors, and it depends on where. So I think this is quite important in that sense. But at the same time, on the political front, the outreach and the willingness to work with other parties to unlock this transitional period, unlock the elections of a president that would also include a broader vision on where Lebanon could go. And this includes discussions around the implementation of 1701. There's always also now mention of 1680. The 1680 is the resolution that came out in May of 2006, and that was meant to maintain control and emphasize the need for Lebanese army control between the borders between Lebanon and Syria. 1701, by the way, relies on all of these things. So talking about 1701 or 1559 for me is moot, because the only way you can implement 1701 is if you implement 1559, and also if you fully implement the Ta'if agreement, which talked about the disarmament of all armed groups in the country after the end of the civil war. So I think Hezbollah today is in a conundrum between the need to continue the battle, rally the troops, doubling down on sectarian identity. They are hurt and they've been hit, and I think we need to recognize that. But also the other political parties in the country need to also open a space for dialogue, for an inclusive dialogue that brings in together different components of Lebanese society. If they don't do that, the danger is we may be moving towards greater chaos, civil strife, maybe a return of assassination campaigns. We don't know. But the situation is incredibly tense on the ground. The other thing I want to mention with regards to something Michael mentioned, which is the strategy of Israel vis-a-vis the South and the widespread destruction that we're seeing. Honestly, I'm becoming more and more convinced that what we're looking at, if we look at both the widespread destruction, and it's horrific. I mean, it's senseless in many ways, hitting the center of Nabatieh, the historic center of Nabatieh, for no other reason other than to simply destroy. The levels of, entire villages have literally been now wiped out in southern Beirut. In southern Lebanon. It's turning the south into a total wasteland. And when you put that together with the attack on the UNIFIL, the undermining of the UNIFIL, the demand that the UNIFIL leave the south of the country, it tells me that maybe the plan is really to create an empty space in that area, at least north of the Litani, and to literally make it uninhabitable in the way that Gaza has become uninhabitable. Now, Lebanon is different from Gaza in the sense this is a country. I mean, there are different dynamics at work, but I think this is something we need to be very aware of and keep our eye on as we move forward. And just one final point on the issue of UNIFIL. I mean, just to zoom out of Lebanon again, I'm very concerned about it's not just the targeting of UNIFIL. Israel has been trying to undermine, and we've seen that multiple UN organizations, including UNIFIL, UNRWA. We started with UNRWA, the ICJ, the ICC, effectively organizations that were put in place in the post-World War II era to address the Holocaust, and that emerged out of that era, the international system, the organizations that were put in place at the time. This is now what is being attacked, and that is being, and with an attempt to really weaken to the extent possible.
Thank you, Maha. So now I'm looking at the wider regional context, specifically Iran as a major player inside Lebanon and a major player in this conflict, specifically after the recent direct confrontation between Israel and Iran, Iran missile strikes against Israel, and now the anticipated Israeli response against Iran. What are the dynamics at play here, and how do you think this conflict? What are the pathways of this conflict, depending on what type of strike against Iran? Given that we're hearing a lot about U.S. pressure trying to adjust the Israeli position, and we've all seen how that has went elsewhere during the course of this conflict since October last year.
Thank you, Mohannad, and it's a pleasure to be with you today, despite the grim topic. I think Iran, I would say, is also in a bind. Of course, this has been a long year, and there have been many twists and turns to Iran and the axis of resistance, with moments where Iran appeared to be in a stronger tactical position. But certainly over the past 6 months, we have seen repeated direct assassinations that have impacted Iranian IRGC commanders across the region, Iran's capabilities across the region, but of course, Iran's key relationships across the region, be it with Hamas, with Hezbollah, with Hania and Tehran. There have been real setbacks for Tehran. And it's very clear that Iran, despite not wanting a broader regional war, has really risked and gambled a lot over this past year, trying to walk this fine line between supporting the axis of resistance and supporting the unification of Iranian's strategy that has been in development. Let's say this past year has been a test run for the unification of the Iranian strategy, and it hasn't gone very well for Iran. Iran has committed to not escalating or supporting its Axis partners directly, and that has, of course, raised questions about Iran's role, Iran's support of the Axis. It's made it very clear that Iran, above all, prioritizes its own security and stability. And each time we have seen Iran directly escalate, it has been in response to what it sees as a breach of its own security interests, rather than solely the Axis's interest. So I think Iran is in a very difficult situation, a dilemma of serious proportion that has impact in the short term, but over a longer period of time. And I can try to pick apart some of these issues quickly. First of all, Iran has now, since the start of this year, escalated in a significant way. We've seen airstrikes, missile strikes in January in response to terrorism incidents in Iran. We have then seen an Iranian direct military strike on Israel in April, mid-April, in response to the Damascus airstrike, and again now in October, really because Iran's role was being questioned, its red lines had been completely erased in the region, and of course, it felt the need, compelled to respond to Nasrallah's killing. Nasrallah having perhaps replaced Qasem Soleimani since his death in January 2020, and Nasrallah having such an important relationship with the highest echelons of Iran's political establishment, including the supreme leader. So Iran has now really redefined the nature of its relationship with Israel, and taken a new confrontation in order to try and protect its position in the region, in order to try and preserve the axis of resistance, if you will, that has certainly been degraded but not eliminated, as you've all described. But above all, I think that Iran is hoping that its objectives, which can oftentimes appear contradictory, can be met simultaneously. By escalating, Iran is hoping to achieve two things, in addition to keeping the axis somewhat intact and to prevent a massive Israeli escalation. Iran is looking more broadly at preserving its regional relationships. And in fact, over the past 2 weeks, while we are waiting for the Israeli counterstrike, we have seen a very robust level of Iranian diplomatic engagement across the region in an unprecedented way. This engagement hasn't just been led by the Iranian president or the Iranian foreign minister. You've also seen Iran's parliament head, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, land his own plane in Beirut and walk the streets to try to showcase exactly what Mahan and Michael referred to, building morale among Hezbollah and trying to show that Iran actually is invested and intends to support Hezbollah, whether that's the case or not. Additionally, the foreign minister traveled to Saudi Arabia, sat with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, a visual that maybe we wouldn't have imagined a year ago, let alone a few years ago, all to build, through this sort of dialogue, pressure and an avenue of greater engagement for Iran in the region. And the message has really been to make clear to Iran's neighbors that they shouldn't support or participate in any counterstrike against Israel, and that through direct dialogue, this is the best means forward about managing tense dynamics. I mean, and this is what's important to mention, very tense dynamics between Iran and its regional neighbors. And I think this speaks to a broader, maybe transition underway in Iran, where it is certainly reevaluating the effectiveness of the axis of resistance over a longer period of time at providing Iran with some kind of asymmetrical defense. Because what is really clear now is that the axis of resistance hasn't provided Iran with the defense it seeks, and Iran is also not providing enough support for the axis of resistance. So maybe over time, there will be a reevaluation of that relationship. It's hard to speak confidently about that now, but I think that there could be some movements and shifts there that provide openings in each of the country contexts, Palestine, Lebanon, Iraq, and Yemen, but it depends on other regional players and partners to invest in those contexts. But also more broadly, it's opening a debate inside Iran about its defense doctrine and what Iran needs in order to shore up its defense, whether that is further investment in its nuclear program, or is it opening a very serious and meaningful dialogue with the West in order to achieve a more substantial and robust sense of sanctions relief, which also seems hard to imagine in the current context of today. So the landscape is clearly quite difficult to manage. Iran is certainly expecting an Israeli response, and the leadership in Israel has made it clear that that response is going to be severe and lethal. But perhaps what the past 2 weeks have managed to achieve is that Israel will not likely strike Iran's nuclear facilities, and the U.S. has shown that it won't support that activity. Perhaps there won't be a direct strike on export energy facilities inside Iran, but instead, in keeping with Israel's rationale for degrading the axis of resistance, Israel will look to degrade Iran's ballistic and missile capability, drone capabilities, and in general, its military posture in the region. So that's what I anticipate is going to come. If that attack is proportional and relatively calibrated, Iran has said that it will, not respond further. But I imagine that would have to come with incentives and some kind of behind-the-scenes commitments, perhaps to open the door to negotiations on some other issues.
Thank you, Sanam. Just moving on from this point specifically, you've mentioned that, and you and Maha, that there's a kind of an direct Iranian presence and leader, in terms of leading the Hezbollah organization, and also the giving the wider community a sense of confidence, restoring some of the morale that has been hit in the past 2 weeks. But how is this, Michael, playing out on the Lebanese scene? Having a direct Iranian presence, the Abbas Araghchi, the Iranian foreign minister, showed up in Beirut saying that Gaza and Lebanon are still one front, and there's a need for a ceasefire on both fronts, and also the aftermath of this conflict, because at the end of the day, while Hezbollah is fighting a war with Israel, there are internal dynamics which are changing and in certain cases becoming more severe and more challenging for the organization. But how do you see the conflict playing out in its elements and in the direct Iranian involvement in the next phase within Lebanon and the Lebanese context that you've written about in the past?
Look, I think that certainly Araghchi's comments when he came to Beirut, where there was pushback from the Druze leader Walid Jumblat, the sense that the Iranians are willing to fight to the last Lebanese just to preserve their influence in the country. So definitely among the Lebanese communities, I think it's safe to say that most Lebanese do not want this war and are not happy that Hezbollah has dragged Lebanon into this war. So on that level, I don't think there's really a consensus behind this position adopted by the Iranians. But there is another dimension here that we have to really clarify a little bit. What is it that the Israelis actually want to do? And this is, I haven't really seen a clear answer here. It seems that the Israelis today have a number of options in Lebanon. And each of these options, in a way, is going to affect how they are perceived and how Hezbollah is perceived in Lebanon. Because each of these options is going to take a different period of time. And I think the longer the Israelis stay in Lebanon, the more Hezbollah will be able to build up a little bit of its lost, the consensus that has collapsed. In other words, on the one hand, there is, as Maha was saying, you've got the Resolution 1701, which would theoretically involve an Israeli push up to the Litani River, keeping the land up to the Litani River, and basically holding on to it in exchange for reinforced security guarantees. which would not allow Hezbollah to go south of the Litani. Maybe, maybe a UN resolution, a stronger UN resolution. Some have suggested maybe under Chapter 7, a stronger mandate for UNIFIL, that kind of thing. If that happens and it's relatively quick, then I think it will be difficult for Hezbollah to really turn the tide of public opinion. But there is another possibility in terms of the Israeli planning. It's to push as far north as the Awali. And indeed, as you know, they've told the inhabitants of the south not to go south of the Awali. And that would be more along the lines of implementing 1559. You push up to the Awali, you basically, the Israelis control up to Sidon, and then use their control of South Lebanon to begin systematically destroying Hezbollah arms caches throughout the country. Now, this would be an operation that would take more time, that would involve a longer Israeli presence throughout South Lebanon, that would, involve, of course, Israel going, Israeli troops may be transported by helicopters or other means around the country to destroy these things. It would actually create a situation where effectively Israel is behaving much like it behaved in 1982 after the Israeli invasion of 1982. And I lived through that invasion. I can say that initially, many Lebanese and many South Lebanese were not unhappy to see the PLO removed from South Lebanon. But then typically the Israelis overextended their stay and the tide began to turn against them. And I think this is a little bit what we should question today is what are the Israeli plans? The longer the Israelis stay in Lebanon and begin systematically trying to destroy and implement, let's say, enforce 1559, you're going to see gradually more and more organization of a movement against them within the Shia community. And Hezbollah will, I believe, strengthen itself through that. Hezbollah, we have to understand today, is there is no open Shia criticism of Hezbollah today. The community today is not willing to openly criticize Hezbollah. On the contrary, it feels that if Hezbollah is weakened, the community itself may be weakened. But on top of this, if Hezbollah is beginning to score successes in the south along the lines of what they did yesterday, this is going to reinforce the party, not weaken it. And I think the Israeli, whatever Israel plans, is going to determine Hezbollah's ability, and of course the ability, because your question was on the Iranians, Iran's ability to reorganize this Hezbollah as a resistance organization.
Thank you, Michael. I mean, just to build on this point specifically, the plans that we're seeing, and also the 1701 draft that's being floated around, the news of the 1701 plus draft that is being leaked into the media, are looking at reconstituting the political system in Lebanon. And early elections is being proposed within 60 days of the end of the war, and also a new president or a new government. There was a push for a new presidential elections just right after the surprise Israeli attacks. Maha, how possible or how plausible are these options being floated around in terms of quick fixes in a country which is known for its history of consociational power sharing dynamics that really take a very long time, whether to vote in a president or select a new government. It's not a country where politics do reach results quickly. So how realistic are these initiatives and attempts? I think Maha, you're muted, so if you can unmute.
Okay, here we are.
Thank you.
I think not very realistic, and it's coming from as you know, it's very difficult for the Security Council today to come out with a resolution, given the tensions within the Security Council. So let's begin with that. Getting something at the level of the United Nations Security Council is, I would say, mission impossible at this point. Maybe there is some background discussion happening that we're not aware of between that involves Russia, China, all the different groupings. But at this point, I think it's quite difficult. Hezbollah is reading these moves as an attack, as a way, people are moving in very quickly to say Hezbollah's been hit, they're weakened, they're disoriented. Therefore, let's try and recalibrate power relations in Lebanon on the basis of one moment in the battle. What Hezbollah is saying is wait until the dust of the battle settles and then we can talk. And I think that's where the tension is. They've already said that we're not willing to go towards the election of a new president whilst the fighting is continuing. And this has come not from Hezbollah, but from Iran. It was very clear that after the assassination of the Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, they were in a point where they wanted to decouple Lebanon and Gaza and move towards some sort of ceasefire that would perhaps also unlock a presidency. The insistence was that the president would be someone that would not necessarily stab them in the back, but they would go away from they would move away from their more hardline choices, if you like. That moment is gone now. And I think it's very difficult in this context to push forward unless there are sufficient incentives and guarantees that tell Hezbollah, but also the broader Shia community, you are going to be part of a broader Lebanon project, at least for the Shia community. For Hezbollah, I think the conversation is happening with Iran, not with Hezbollah in Lebanon. And the foreign minister has made it very clear. So unless Iran is part of this discussion around the roadmap for Lebanon, moving away from here, away from the fighting, it's an open question. I think in terms of the debate around Resolution 1701 and the implications, I found it odd in these leaks around this plan, proposal that's being made. Is they're calling for an election? They're calling very clearly, trying to, as you said, Muhannad, trying to reconstitute the entire political system at this particular moment of weakness for one party. And I just don't see this happening. I also don't see it happening in a context where there is half the country. Sorry, I have to remember something went off, and I have to remember I'm not in Beirut right now. Anyway, so you have more than 1.2 million people displaced. Massive destruction in at least two parts of the country, the southern suburbs, the South Lebanon, but also in the Bekaa. And so I have a hard time seeing how we would be organizing elections in this kind of a context. And it's very hard to justify why we would be moving to elections very quickly, except to say we want to change the power structure. Which is obviously going to frighten Hezbollah and turn them away and make them double down even more on the sectarian discourse. So I think the feasibility of something like this happening, I don't see in all frankness. Now, can there be some sort of incentives behind the scenes diplomacy with Iran, with Hezbollah to try and move away from the context of actual battle, but also saying that in the, whatever comes next, whatever political project for Lebanon, including the presidency, including, a new defense strategy, including, you will be part of this discussion. You are an essential component. If there is that kind of a discussion, even if it's diplomatic behind the scenes, but I think for many Lebanese, it's practically impossible to accept that Hezbollah continue to be armed and continue to be the key decision maker on war and peace in the country. This is the second time where there's been a major miscalculation. 2006 was one, and now, this 2023, and it's led to a horrific conflict, a horrific war, which today has surpassed everything that we saw in 2006 already.
Thank you, Maha.
If I can just, sorry, Mohannad, add also one thing on the political as well. And I think going back to the reconstruction project, it's impossible. I don't see, we're going to need massive amounts of funding for the reconstruction and return of the displaced. I don't see that happening without conditionalities.
Yes, thank you, Maha, for this. Looking at, going back to the Iranian player, the major, basically, player and one of the major players in this conflict, there has been lots of talk in the past, specifically after the killing of Ismail Haniyeh, the Hamas political bureau chief in Tehran, that Iranian factionalism led to the lack of response. Of course, now there's talk that there's a regret about this, delay in responding to the Haniyeh attack and the consequences of that delay. But I think many would like to understand the impact of Iranian factionalism, the Iranian regime factionalism, and the dynamics. Who are the players, and what are the dynamics at play, and what are the debates at the moment within Iran? You mentioned something about looking back at that past period and the gambling that Iran has done in terms of unity of front and this expanded relationship with its allies in the region, leading to the point of October 7 and this conflict, which has dragged Iran into a direct confrontation with Israel.
Sure, thanks, Mohannad. Many people discount politics inside Iran as being relevant, obviously, because Iran's political system has a supreme leader who sits at the top, and the system is very much divided, or let's say dominated by institutions where he appoints key figures or his loyalists to those institutions, and the electoral systems like the presidency and the parliament have limited autonomy. And that's certainly one way of examining politics inside Iran. But the importance of factionalism, I think, cannot be discounted, because we have seen how individuals within the system do matter. And I would argue that they will matter more and more going forward, because the Iranian system is in a period of transition, with the supreme leader being quite aged. He has been in power for 30 years, and certainly the system and the key figures within the system and the key factions within the system are concerned about their future and the place in the future Islamic Republic 3.0, if we can imagine it. So this new president that was elected by fluke, by chance, in a surprise election after the death of Ebrahim Raisi, has certainly had some impact within the system. Iran, by all accounts, has a legitimacy crisis. There's less and less voter participation in elections. We can see year after year the increasing detachment between the state and many more cleavages across the landscape of Iran through protests, as well as choice by not coming out to vote and boycotting. But the emergence of Pezeshkian, who doesn't call himself a reformist but a moderate, has indeed perhaps brought a new element that we should consider. First of all, he campaigned on the platform of improving the economy, which he has connected to negotiations and sanctions relief that he can only obtain through negotiations with the West. And there clearly has been a discussion among his constituency and his political circles that the best strategy to try and build back some lost legitimacy between the political establishment and the people is by improving the economy. And by all accounts, economic conditions remain bleak. Inflation is above 50%. The currency continues to devaluate and fluctuate depending on the fears of war, and it's certainly taken another hit over the past 2 weeks. So this dynamic does matter. Another interesting feature about Pezeshkian is that he has tried to build his strategy with the support of the supreme leader, not in opposition. And so his outreach in New York at UNGA a few weeks ago, his regional engagement has that consensus across the political establishment. His cabinet also is not solely a reform or moderate cabinet, but has brought together holdovers from the Raisi administration, as well as some key ministers who have relationships, for example, with Speaker of the Parliament, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf. So I think he's taking a consensus-based approach in order to maybe reduce factionalism and gain a bit more trust among these competing factions. Where does that have influence right now? Certainly, after Hania was killed, there was a debate inside the country over how to respond. And most of these decisions are made in the Supreme National Security Council, where there are diverse members of the political establishment sit, including head of the IRGC, including head of the Quds Force, and including Saeed Jalili, who is from the hardline Paidari front within the system, and he ran for president as well alongside Pezeshkian. So you have a wide-ranging representation in that system, and in that scenario, Pezeshkian and his team clearly made a strong enough case to wait, to practice what Iran, traditionally calls strategic patience, and hope that by not responding to Hania's death, which was a huge embarrassment for Tehran, showing intelligence gaps and its own weaknesses, that perhaps the landscape might change, the attention might turn to Gaza and a ceasefire. And when that didn't happen, of course, and Iran took a series of more severe hits with the walkie-talkie pager attacks, that operation, coupled with obviously the killing of Hezbollah's command structure, followed by Hassan Nasrallah himself. That was one step too far for the Iranian leadership, and the hardliners or conservatives within the establishment that had made the argument that strategic patience won't pay off for Iran clearly won out. And so, the debate, I think, is very much ongoing. This is a bit of a test, and Iran clearly has multiple approaches that it is testing simultaneously in order to achieve its aims in the region. As I said before, it is primarily focused on its own security and stability. It does want to preserve the axis of resistance, help it recalibrate, but it recognizes that the landscape in Gaza, in Lebanon, is very fraught. That strategy, as Michael and Maha have discussed, is going to be very hard. And simultaneously, its broader objective, if it can be achieved, is negotiations with the West. And it's certainly very aware that the next US president, be it Trump or Harris, will have to in some way address the issue of Iran's accelerated nuclear program and this direct confrontation between Iran and Israel in the region. So it's hedging, it's working its diplomatic channels, and ultimately it's hoping that by keeping this consensus together in the landscape of Iran's domestic politics, that it can manage a lot of the uncertainties on the horizon today.
Thank you, Sanam, for this. We still have about 10 minutes, 11 minutes for this event, but we have a great number of questions from the audience. So I will pass on a couple of questions to Michael. One is, does the panel from Alistair Burt, does this panel think there is any risk of the Lebanese army being drawn into the conflict at any stage? That's on one hand. The other is about the media, which is, that the media has, this is from Celine Victor, the media has largely provided disastrous coverage of this event. How can academia and research centers counter a biased journalistic narrative that disregards the victims of this conflict? Michael?
Okay, thank you, Mohanad. On the first question, what worries me today was Netanyahu's comments a few days ago, his speech, where he recorded, and he basically said, now is the time for the Lebanese to push back against Hezbollah. Otherwise, they may face a terrible outcome. See their country destroyed. I mean, essentially, what he was doing was offering two choices: either you enter into the possibility of a civil war, or you enter into the possibility that Israel will destroy more. What worries me, Mohanad, is that if the Israelis see that Lebanese society is not really pushing back against Hezbollah, because actually we cannot push back against Hezbollah today, and if they see that the political class is not willing to elect a new president, I worry that the Israelis will escalate against the country, and not just target, as they are today, mainly areas where Hezbollah is in control, but go beyond that and begin targeting things like infrastructure. Now, in that context, I think we are more likely to see the Lebanese army being drawn into the fray. But having said that, the army is very careful not to enter into a direct confrontation with Israel for a variety of reasons. It's the only security force in the country that can maintain social stability. And I think at the same time, there is probably sympathy from the outside, even from the Americans, who have been hypocritical throughout this process. But I don't think the Americans want to see the Lebanese army in any way destroyed. In particular, they don't want to see the commander of the army, who they appear to, at least unofficially, appear to favor as president, undermined by any kind of situation where the Lebanese army is drawn into the fray. So, I mean, it's always conceivable that the army will be drawn in, but I still think the institution will try to avoid this. Because the army is very good at survival. It's a reflection of our society. Now, in terms of the media, well, I agree with Sinan Victor that the media has provided relatively disastrous coverage of this event, but I'm not sure that research centers have really done a great job themselves, at least in the United States. I think research centers in the United States, and you will allow me to say this. Of course, I don't mean Carnegie, but the fact is that many research centers in the United States are very ideological, and they push a particular agenda. And so I'm not sure that the truth comes out of the research centers. And academia itself has been very divided by this conflict, which is a divisive conflict. What can to be very honest, what I found is that once this conflict is over, it will be good to look back over how the media has covered it. I think the media has tried to be fair, to be honest, and there have been quite a lot of stories that have broken that are very important. But there is a fact that many people on all sides believe that this media outlet or that one is very unfair or very biased. I agree that in some cases there have been biases, but I also believe that very important stories have been broken in the last year. So that's my remark.
Thank you, Michael. Maha, I will ask you this question from the audience. What are the worst case, best case, and most likely scenarios for future developments in Lebanon and the region? This is from Ricardo Khoury. Please.
Just 2 words, though, on the previous questions, if I may. I think the Lebanese army has already been somewhat drawn into it. We've lost a number of Lebanese army personnel who have been through Israeli shelling. Whether accidental or not is another story. But so they haven't been, I agree, concur with Michael that they haven't been drawn in fully, but they have been targeted. And on the media, I think it depends on which media we're talking about. Some of the mainstream media, and I think part of our issue with the way this whole conflict has been covered, is the utter dehumanization of Palestinians and now Lebanese lives. We don't make, there's no blip almost in terms of, the stories of people who have been killed, civilians who are just literally evaporating into thin air under a brutal war machinery that's not only destroying bricks and stones, but is completely destroying lives. If we just look at Gaza, we're talking about more than 42,000 people officially dead, and most likely another 10 to 20,000 under the rubble, more than 100,000 injured. The number of child amputees is horrific. Orphans, more than 20,000 children in Gaza today are either orphaned or without family members. So the numbers, this trauma is going to last for a very long time. So to reconstitute that kind of love, and this has not been covered sufficiently in the mainstream. However, when one looks, one can find, and there are a number of outlets. I'll name The Guardian, for example, in London, that has been putting out some really interesting critical articles by a broad variety of authors on the conflict. People on different social media have been trying to also present an alternative point of view, and the New Republic and others. I'm thinking of, for example, the Portuguese journalist Bruno Magalhães, amongst others. So there are journalists out there who have tried, but it's not, if we focus only on the mainstream media, then we won't find the answer there. On the different scenarios, I think the challenge that we have today, at least I'll give broadly speaking and build on what Michael was saying. I think we were looking at the worst case scenario is the prospect of basically Israeli occupation up to the Litani, and then utter chaos and civil strife beyond the Litani to, in the rest of the country. Falling back into the cycle of civil conflict, but also, I don't know that it will be a civil war, a full-blown civil war as in 1975. Times have changed, but definitely civil strife, more chaos, lawlessness, etc. We're talking about a country that has been suffering from an economic and financial collapse over the last 5 years, as well as an institutional weakening. The middle case scenario is that there is some sort of a ceasefire, and this links to the more positive outlook, is that there is some sort of a ceasefire agreement that would open the door for a diplomatic resolution, not only to the blue line, cessation of hostilities between the two parties, but also unlocks an internal political dialogue around which direction the country should be going in. That is a path fraught with difficulty, not only because of the external dimension, but also because of the internal dynamics within the country and the relationship between the different groups.
And that applies to the UN role as well, right? I mean, in
Yes.
terms of the mediating role.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Maha.
Absolutely, Mohanad. Thank you.
Sanam, how do you comment on the assumption that says, this is from the audience, from Hassan Nasrallah, a Lebanese writer, how do you comment on the assumption that says a weaker Hezbollah is an outcome of the new consensual behavior or the new behavior of Iran. Not sure what he means with that, and that Tehran's new foreign policy can't continue with old faces and tools.
Interesting, I think, in the implication. I'm not sure I completely understand the direction. Let me pick up on it through, and also pick up on something that Maha said. She mentioned that any political settlement in the Lebanese context, and I would actually also broaden it to the Palestinian context as well, should endeavor to at least through an adjacent dialogue and also include Iran, and repeating the sort of past political settlements that have kept Iran out of the conversation or not had Iranian buy-in have always worked negatively for all of the states where Iran is regionally aggressive in. So I would strongly argue, and I do strongly argue repeatedly, that including Iran into these future political settlements and dynamics is the best way to find a way to create accountability from the Iranian side and build in new mechanisms of buy-in. It's a broader, much more complex negotiation and discussion that is probably also going to require linkages back to Iran's broader portfolio of challenges with the United States and the West. But if security and sovereignty and political stability is to come out of these devastating wars in the region, one way to do so is through inclusivity with Iran and forcing them to be an actor that supports what comes next. Iran is opportunistic and has repeatedly over multiple decades tried to take advantage of divisions, poor governance structures for its own political purposes. And more broadly, I think Iran is debating how its foreign policy is going to evolve. Certainly, there are plenty of old faces within the Iranian political system fighting and vying for their future. But what the Iranian political establishment, I think, is quite effective at doing is adapting and adjusting its foreign policy. It did adjust its engagement across the region. The IRGC adjusted its engagement after the death of Qasem Soleimani. The nature of the relationships became more decentralized, more dependent on Hezbollah, less directly dependent on Iran. And certainly out of this period of conflict, depending on how Iran and the axis of resistance survives, there will be another adjustment. And these groups are learning, they're not static. And I think, we have to see them as part of these states, and they have bureaucratic discussions. There's a way to look at them and try to enforce accountability on them. It's a bit of a harder process that I think Western governments are not inclined to think about, but if we approach them as rational actors, not solely as irrational actors, that might be one way to move forward. I think the bigger challenge, however, is if political settlements are to emerge at the end of this horrible period of war and escalation across the region, but primarily in Gaza and Lebanon, what we have to do is also build in support from Arab states, the Gulf states, above all, but more broadly, consensus and buy-in has to come from Israel. And currently, that discussion and that kind of thinking has not taken place. If the international community is going to be having these broader negotiation processes, the buy-in and the tick-boxing exercise of supporting these processes, in addition to coming from Iran, also has to come from Israel.
Thank you, Sanam. Unfortunately, this panel and instant discussion has come to an end. I thank you, Michael, Sanam, and Maha for this very interesting and lively conversation. I apologize for not taking all the questions, but please stay tuned for more events from the Malcolm H. Carnegie Center in Beirut. And thank you very much and goodbye.